Welcome back. Pope Urban had been a monk and then prior at Cluny before becoming Pope in 1088, and spent much of his pontificate in a struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and the Roman antipope Clement III, often operating from southern Italy and France rather than securely from Rome. By 1095, his situation was improving. He had growing support from reform-minded bishops and from powerful allies, like the Normans in southern Italy and Sicily. Henry IV's position, meanwhile, had weakened, which gave Urban more room to pursue wider projects that could display and expand papal leadership and further strengthen his power. So when Alexios' envoys approached Urban at the Council of Piacenza in March 1095, asking for Western military help against the Seljuk Turks, Urban treated this as an opportunity to present the papacy and himself as protector of Eastern Christians. It was also a golden opportunity to channel Latin knightly violence towards fighting the infidel rather than towards internal wars in Western European Christendom. Given our discussion last time on the Great Schism, you would be forgiven for wondering whether he also saw this as a chance to heal that schism. But the answer, surprisingly, is apparently not. Certainly the schism had profoundly and perhaps permanently damaged the power and position of the Pope. It excluded the Pope from authority over half of Christendom, reduced his practical influence in regions like the Balkans and Russia, and confined papal supremacy claims to the Latin West. But while it was part of the background noise to the position Urban II found himself in, there's nothing in any contemporary sources to indicate that healing the schism was any part of his thinking. If it had been, including steps towards healing the breach would have featured as conditions of providing aid to Byzantium. What it did do, however, was strengthen his position over Henry IV's antipope, Clement III. By calling for the crusade, Urban demonstrated the power he had over Western Christendom, effectively sidelining Clement. You can think of Urban's interventions at Piacenza and later at Clermont as a two-stage process. First, a relatively technical response to Alexios' appeal at Piacenza, then a fully elaborated crusade summons at Clermont a few months later. Piacenza was a large reform council in northern Italy, where Urban dealt mainly with church discipline and other doctrinal matters. Alexios' envoys appeared there to request armed assistance against the Turks. Urban seems to have received the Byzantine request, signalled sympathy, and begun sounding out receptivity to a broader expedition. The council drew large numbers of Italians and northern European bishops, abbots, and secular magnates, including figures from Lombardy, Tuscany, and France. Urban addressed this mixed audience directly about Alexios' plea, calling on many men to swear oaths to come to the emperor's aid against the Turks, securing initial commitments from influential Western leaders. When the Council of Piacenza ended in March 1095, Urban undertook an extensive tour through southern and central France to consolidate support for his emerging project. At each stop, he floated the idea of armed aid to Byzantium, gauging reactions from bishops, abbots, and lay magnates alike. This massive tour, the first major papal visit to France in nearly 50 years, drew huge crowds with spectacular ceremonies, boosting Urban's prestige as a peripatetic reform pope operating outside imperial-controlled Rome. He consulted key French lords, refining his message from Piacenza's limited oaths to aid the emperor into the full penitential crusade appeal that he eventually made at the Council of Clermont in November of the same year. It also allowed him to shift his emphasis from recruiting mercenaries for Byzantium to a broader liberation of Jerusalem and the Eastern churches. By the time he got to Clermont, this groundwork ensured a primed audience of French elites ready to respond enthusiastically. Clermont was another reform council, but Urban used its closing session, again before a mixed lay and clerical audience, to deliver the speech that later sources present as inaugurating the First Crusade. Multiple versions of the speech survive, all agreeing that Urban described Eastern Christian sufferings, denounced Turks and Saracens, and urged Western knights to take up arms as an act of penance, promising remission of sins to those who went and, if need be, died on the expedition. The Clermont accounts show Urban weaving together reform and warfare. He attacks private wars and lawlessness in the west and then urges knights to redirect their violence against infidels, effectively sacralizing warfare. He focused on the idea of the journey as an armed pilgrimage, with spiritual rewards, in particular the immediate remission of sins, granted under papal authority. By all accounts, Urban's speech was met with immediate and overwhelming enthusiasm from the assembled crowd of clerics, knights, and lay people. Eyewitnesses and near-contemporary accounts alike describe the audience chanting, "God wills it," after he finished. The response was so fervent that Urban himself thanked God for it, interpreting the unanimity as divine presence, and he formalized the cross as the Crusaders' symbol. Many nobles and knights present took crusading vows on the spot. Key figures like Adhemar of Le Puy and Raymond IV of Toulouse committed publicly, sparking rapid recruitment across France. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, Alexios had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. After Piacenza, he was waiting for his 2,000 to 10,000 mercenaries, little suspecting what was already on its way to him. But he would soon find out. The People's Crusade formed spontaneously in the wake of Urban's Clermont speech, driven by popular preaching rather than organised church direction, allowing it to mobilise and march far faster than the principal armies. Peter the Hermit, a charismatic wandering preacher from Amiens, claimed a vision or direct commission from Christ and probably heard Urban's appeal second-hand. He began itinerant preaching across northern France, Flanders and the Rhineland immediately after Clermont, drawing paupers, peasants, minor knights and zealots with promises of spiritual reward and divine protection. Peter's message, framed as an urgent armed pilgrimage, tapped into existing fervour, famine hardships and pilgrimage traditions, swelling his following to around 40,000 mostly untrained non-combatants, who set off for the Holy Land without waiting for Urban's planned August 1096 departure. The plan to leave in August was deliberate. It meant that the Crusaders would be travelling during the period after harvest, when food along the route would be plentiful. By leaving early in the year, Peter's group all but ensured they would struggle to find food the further into the journey they went. Peter coordinated loosely with Walter Saint-Savoy's smaller, better-led French band. Walter's group left first in late 1095, early 1096, crossing into Germany, Hungary, and reaching Constantinople by late May of 1096. Peter's larger force, assembled at Cologne in April 1096, then trekked overland via the Danube through Hungary with imperial escorts after minor clashes, and Bulgaria, covering about 1,500 miles in 3 to 4 months despite supply issues, arriving in Constantinople by August of 1096. As the movement progressed through the Rhineland and Central Europe, discipline quickly broke down. Some bands turned to violence and pillage to sustain themselves, while others attacked Jewish communities, committing massacres that neither church authorities nor secular rulers could effectively prevent. Word of the People's Crusade reached Constantinople around mid-1096, as Peter the Hermit's ragtag army of peasants, pilgrims and minor knights approached from Hungary, prompting Alexios to fear widespread pillaging of Byzantine lands after their disruptive passage through the Balkans. His daughter, Anna Komneni, later chronicled his grave concern that all the West, even the barbarians beyond the Adriatic, were marching with families in tow, uncontrolled by any reliable leaders. Alexios hastily reinforced city defensive, rationed supplies to avoid depletion, and got the Crusaders across the Bosphorus as quickly as he could, providing minimal transport and supplies to expedite their departure before they could turn violent in the capital. Once there, internal divisions amongst the Crusaders worsened, and the Crusaders split into smaller contingents. The decisive collapse came in the autumn of 1096, when Turkish Seljuk forces exploited the Crusaders' lack of coordination and military experience. the People's Crusade was effectively annihilated. People were killed, enslaved, or forced to retreat, leaving only a few people to be absorbed later into the arriving armies of the First Crusade. One of them was the man who led them to their deaths or slavery in the first place. Peter the Hermit escaped unscathed and took a position in the First Crusade when it finally arrived in Constantinople. Alexios must have known that he was almost certainly sending them to their deaths when he transported them across the Bosphorus, but he had little other choice. Understandably, he viewed Peter the Hermit's poorly armed horde as a liability prone to pillaging Byzantine territory. Prolonged presence in Constantinople would likely amplify pillaging due to food shortages and growing frustration among the starving mob, whereas dispatching them minimised imperial losses. Even if they ignored the advice he gave them not to engage the Turks in battle, it cleared the threat without depleting Byzantine troops. This reflected Alexios' overarching goal: protect the empire first, using the undisciplined crusaders as a disposable buffer against the Turks if needs be. The arrival and destruction of the People's Crusade taught Alexios that Western enthusiasm had exploded far beyond what he had imagined. Instead of a few hired contingents, he was dealing with entire social strata on the move, as likely to pillage Byzantine lands en route as they were to protect the empire against the Seljuks. He understood that undisciplined mobs were militarily useless and politically dangerous, and his priority became to move such groups across the Bosphorus as fast as possible and let the Turks take care of them rather than let them linger near Constantinople. Any real princely armies following behind would have to be tightly managed. The People's Crusade made him more determined to impose conditions and to use those armies as instruments of reconquest rather than give them any chance to behave as independent conquerors. So after the People's Crusade, he was understandably worried. He was anxious about the combination of huge foreign armies on his soil and his own limited ability to coerce them, and politically he feared that powerful Latins might carve out principalities from former Byzantine territories or even threaten Constantinople itself if relations soured. But operationally he also recognised an opportunity. If he could keep them fed, and if he could keep them pointed at the Seljuks, their numbers could achieve what his own resources could not. The Crusader armies began to arrive in Constantinople in late 1096. First to arrive was Hugh of Vermandois, younger brother of King Philip I of France, followed by Godfrey of Bouillon, whose army reached Constantinople in December 1096. Then came the army of Raymond IV of Saint-Gilles, accompanied by the papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy in early 1097, and finally Bohemond of Taranto with his nephew Tancred. As each of the armies arrived and camped outside of Constantinople, Alexios welcomed their leaders to his palace, lavishly entertained them, plied them with gifts, and then required each prince to swear an oath of loyalty, promising to hand back any former Byzantine territory they conquered in return for his protection, supplies, and transport across the Bosphorus. That crossing began in April 1097, after which the Crusaders advanced almost immediately against the Seljuks. A Byzantine escort accompanied them, led by a general called Tatakios, acting as liaison and military guide for the First Crusade leaders, and as a way for Alexios to keep some measure of control over the campaign. The combined army moved inland, reaching their first objective, Nicaea, in May 1097. They surrounded Nicaea on land, while Alexios' forces brought ships over land to a nearby lake, completing a blockade and forcing the city's negotiated surrender to the Byzantines in June 1097. Leaving Nicaea in Byzantine hands, the Crusaders headed on for Dorylaeum, but reaching and securing the area involved a desperate, hard-fought, open-field battle against the Seljuk forces. The Crusader army had split into two columns for the march from Nicaea. Bohemond's advance group of about 20,000 men was ambushed in a narrow valley near Dorylaeum by a much larger Seljuk force of 30,000 light horse archers. The Turks showered arrows from all sides, nearly breaking Bohemond's lines after 7 hours of brutal fighting. Crusaders formed a tight defensive square, suffering heavy losses until reinforcements from the second column, led by Raymond, Godfrey and others, arrived just in time, launching a countercharge that routed the Turks, who fled after losing around 3,000 men. This victory shattered organised Turkish resistance in western Anatolia, allowing the Crusaders to press on towards Antioch without fighting major field battles for months. Although even without fighting, it wasn't an easy journey. The harsh summer march caused many deaths from thirst. The Crusaders reached Antioch in October 1097 and immediately surrounded the massive, heavily fortified city on three sides. A mountain blocked the fourth. A brutal 8-month blockade followed, marked by Crusader desertion, disease and starvation. 1 in 7 died from hunger by early 1098, Turkish sorties and failed relief armies from Damascus and Aleppo. By February 1098, after months of grueling blockade, the Crusaders already faced severe famine. Tatikios had urged the securing of the countryside first, before attempting to capture the city, but his advice had been ignored, and he went back to Alexios amid rising anti-Byzantine distrust, leaving his small force of 2,000, depleted by casualties and attrition, with the Crusaders. Why he left depends on who you ask. Latin accounts accuse him of fleeing in fear, portraying it as cowardice or betrayal. I Komnenos claims Bohemond warned Tatikios of death threats from the other princes, so he left to summon Alexios' aid. It's most likely that he left with Alexios' approval to request reinforcements and supplies, because a Byzantine fleet arrived at St. Simeon on March the 4th with food and siege gear, which would seem to be clear evidence Tatikios wasn't abandoning them. However, his exit did fuel the Crusader narrative that Alexios had deserted them, and Bohemond began to plot his betrayal. This was the same Bohemond that Alexios had defeated at Lycostomon 10 years before, which probably complicated matters. After all, Bohemond had a history of trying to capture Byzantine land. It didn't stop Bohemond taking the oath. He must have recognised there was literally no other alternative, but it's likely that trust on both sides was low. In June 1098, Bohemond made a deal with an Armenian guard, who let a small force scale the walls of Antioch. They massacred the garrison and killed the governor, but the Seljuks still held the citadel. Immediately, a massive relief army, 75,000 men strong, arrived, besieging the exhausting Crusaders themselves inside Antioch. At the end of June, the Crusaders launched a desperate battle to break the siege. The heavy knights shattered the Seljuks' horse archers after hours of fighting. The Turkish forces lost around 10,000 men, but despite still having greater numbers, discipline collapsed. Panic spread through the army and they fled the field. Bohemond took this opportunity to break his oath and seized Antioch as his principality. His reasoning being that as Alexios had not kept his side of the deal, debatable, then Bohemond was freed from any obligation to Alexios. Raymond protested but lacked the support to do anything about it. News of Antioch's fall reached Alexios via Tatikios and deserters while he was advancing towards Philomelion in Anatolia. Reports of Bohemond's claim and the prince's quarrels, in particular Raymond and Bohemond, made him doubt the Franks' reliability, so he retreated to secure his gains in western Anatolia rather than marching on to Syria, prioritising containment over immediate confrontation. Meanwhile, the Crusader army rested until March 1099 and then marched about 400 kilometres through hostile terrain to Jerusalem. They were now down to roughly 1,500 knights and about 12,000 infantry. In June 1099, they laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, blockading it for 5 weeks, with a final assault in the middle of July. The Crusaders stormed the city via ladders and siege towers, starting around dawn. By midday, key breaches overwhelmed defenders, who fled to Al-Aqsa Mosque, synagogues and the citadel. All through that day, the Franks swept through streets, houses and mosques, killing indiscriminately, with eyewitness Raymond of Aguilera describing blood ankle deep by evening. By the next morning, most resistance had ended. Survivors were enslaved, ransomed, or hunted down, with cleanup, mostly burning bodies in pyres, extending into the following day. The Crusaders held the city, but it wasn't entirely secure until they crushed an attempted relief army the following month, after which most Crusaders then sailed home, their job done, leaving Godfrey in charge of Jerusalem as advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. Alexios turned his attention to consolidating imperial gains. Between 1098 and 1100, he prioritised securing cities like Nicaea and Philadelphia, fortifying them against Turkish resurgence. In 1099, he dispatched a fleet to Cilicia and Laodicea, where it supported Raymond IV of Toulouse against Bohemond's Normans in Antioch. This indirect pressure aimed to exploit divisions among the Crusaders, reminding them of their oaths without risking open war, while Alexios methodically rebuilt Byzantine control over Western Asia Minor. From 1100 to 1107, Alexios pursued a deft diplomacy of alliances and subsidies to isolate Bohemond. He cultivated ties with Baldwin I of Jerusalem and even Tancred, Bohemond's nephew and regent in Antioch after Bohemond departed for Europe in 1104 to raise an army against Byzantium. Delegations flowed between Constantinople and the Latin East, backed by gold payments that kept anti-Norman factions amenable, allowing Alexios to focus on Pecheneг threats in the Balkans and Seljuk skirmishes. This patient encirclement frustrated Bohemond's ambitions without committing major Byzantine forces to Syria. Tensions eventually erupted in 1107 when Bohemond invaded Epirus and Illyria with 30,000 men seeking revenge. Alexios responded with scorched earth retreats, Cuman mercenaries, and a Venetian fleet that blockaded Dyrrhachium, besieging Bohemond into submission by 1108. The resulting Treaty of Devil nominally made Antioch a Byzantine vassal, with Bohemond humiliatingly as liegeman, although that became unenforceable after Bohemond's death in 1111 and Tancred's defiance. So Alexios adapted, using naval blockades, rival subsidies, and Anatolian campaigns to reclaim Cilicia while pragmatically tolerating Antioch's de facto independence. By 1111, Alexios was in his early 60s and suffering from a prolonged illness, which had weakened him during his final campaigns. He passed away in Constantinople's Mangana Palace. His daughter Anna Komneni plotted briefly to install her husband as successor, but Alexios' son John II Komnenos seized the throne using the imperial signet ring, which he either found hidden under Alexios' pillow or took it from his dying father's finger, ensuing a smooth dynastic transition. Alexios' 37-year reign was the foundation of the Komnenan Restoration, transforming a near-collapsed empire into a stable, prosperous power through military recovery, administrative reform, and dynastic innovation. He stabilised finances by debasing coinage and taxing nobility, rebuilt the army around land grants to loyal families, and defeated Normans, Pechenegs, and Cumans while reclaiming Western Anatolia via the First Crusade. He created a loyal family government that powered the dynasty's century-long successes under his successors, John II and Manuel I, his son and grandson. He reigned for as long as Justinian I and Basil II, and deserves to be remembered in the same way. But while Justinian inherited a strong empire and left it weaker, and Basil II inherited a strong empire and made it stronger, Alexios inherited an empire on the verge of complete collapse. He stabilised it and renewed it to such an extent that under his son and grandson it would again emerge as a great regional power. Next time, we'll take a look at the ignominious end of the Komnenan dynasty and the rise of possibly the worst family to have reigned over Byzantium, a reign that was to see the beginning of the end of the empire. But until then, thanks very much for joining me. Please remember to like, share and subscribe on your way out, and whatever you do, have a great day.